There's one interesting measure of the man you are about to meet. The least interesting thing I can tell you about him is that he is one of the 100 or so richest people in the world. And this is a society where, as Bob Dylan once said, money doesn't talk, it swears. And where we measure everything from movies to athletes to potential candidates by the size of their income or wealth or money-raising ability. So this may seem like a strange notion, but not if you know anything about the life and work and thinking of George Soros. If you tried to present his life as a movie plot, the most credulous producer would say, come on, that's ridiculous. At age 14, hiding on pain of death from Nazis and their collaborators in Budapest. At 17, confronting the Soviet invasion of his homeland, leaving for England, existing on menial jobs and help not entirely authorized by various agencies, developing a passion for philosophy. At 26, coming to America with the notion of staying here just long enough to get a nest egg so he could go back to England and spend his life studying philosophy. A career on Wall Street always somehow ahead of the curve, and risking increasingly large amounts on stocks, bonds, currencies, ultimately outdueling Her Majesty's government on a bet that the British pound would fall that netted him and his allies in a day $1 billion. Let me put it this way. If you'd given Soros $100,000 in 1969 and left it there, by 1997, you'd have had about $350 million. That's the least interesting fact. Because slowly, somehow, George Soros decided that what he really wanted to do was to give his money away, but not to establish charities, but in fledgling efforts literally around the world to change society, to try to figure out how to plant the seeds of alternative institutions in very repressive places, to nurture the open society of which he's talked and written so much. His efforts now are literally cradle to the grave and beyond, from a Russian Head Start program to a university in Budapest to a study of American attitudes toward death. He is out to reform U.S. drug laws. He's out to train lawyers in the former Soviet Union. He's out to battle TB in the Third World. And in some 50 nations, he's busily giving away each year about $500 million of his fortune. And all the while, he is pushing and badgering nations and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to go headlong at global poverty itself. Just one of the topics that is covered in his new book on globalization. He has been called everything from a revolutionary plutocrat to the one man with his own foreign policy and the means to implement it, to failed philosopher. That's his term for himself. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome failed philosopher George Soros. I told Mr. Soros that we needed to put these microphones very close to our lips, and it turns out he and I, and I guess about 70% of you, share a hearing issue. So we're going to try to not spend the entire evening saying to each other, what? Is this good for you?
That's very good.
Okay. I want to spend most of tonight talking about your ideas and what you've done, but I think a little background is in order. Your father was a devotee of Esperanto, the international language that was invented in part to bring nations together. The question I have about this is, since part of your thinking is a bit about what we as human beings are like, do you think that in some sense that indicates that what you spend the rest of your life on is hardwired? In other words, do you think there's a certain genetic thing in the DNA that says, in one way or another, you were going to wind up trying to change the world?
No, I don't think it's genetic, but I think it definitely is my father's influence. I mean, he has really had a great, he really helped form me. Now, of course, my mother also had a great influence on me, and I loved them both. And they were very often at loggerheads with each other. So this created a kind of a very strange internal conflict inside me, which it took me practically my whole life to work out.
I can't imagine anyone in this audience identifying with a clash between a mother and a father. It's unknown to most of us. there's a more serious part of your early background, and again, I want to explore whether or not you think it had an impact. It's often been said of you that in your life, when you were accumulating the money, you, as they say in poker, would often put in the whole stack. The bets that you made were extremely out there. Right. On the yen, on real estate investment trusts, on the pound. And at least some people have suggested that if you, at age 14, are literally risking death if you are found out that the person your documents say you are isn't, if your whole family is at risk, that if that's how you grow up, taking chances kind of comes a little easier than it might be to somebody raised comfortably. You think that's right?
No, again, I think it definitely had a great influence, that experience of hiding from the Nazis and the danger. I think that I kind of learned how to handle danger, and I also was quite fascinated by it. So I like to push to the limit, but I certainly don't like to push over the limit. So it's a question of how far can you push and still come out whole. So I think this is an essential element in risk-taking. There are many people who don't like to take risks, and there are people who take too much risk and actually get swept away. And I've sort of always stayed this side of that particular divide.
Well, I ask because in politics, it's interesting to me that many of the politicians who are most comfortable with themselves and are prepared to kind of challenge the conventions, like John McCain, like a couple of the senators who were in action in Vietnam, are people who faced real risk when they were young. And so for them, the idea of taking on a political machine, well, you know, if you're John McCain and you spend 5 years in a North Vietnamese prison camp, not so big a deal.
Yeah, I think that is true of John McCain.
There are just a couple of other areas about fair enough. A couple of other areas about what may have helped form you. When the war ended, and we're talking now about I guess a 15 or a 16-year-old, you practiced your trading skills, I guess it's fair to say, if not on the black market, then a gray market. You were...
Well, actually, I started earlier, because I did it in '44, because my father used me as a kind of runner to execute currency transactions and gold. Because being 13, 14, I was less subject to being stopped. So actually I got a pretty early training in that.
Even better. Do you think that as you went into Wall Street and were dealing in $100 million and billion-dollar gambles, I'm being serious about this, did anything from those formative years stay with you? Did it have any impact? Or is that just some romantic notion that we can dismiss?
No, I mean, basically most of my life I have not thought about what happened in those, I put it behind me. But certainly I'd learned certain ways of acting, and particularly I learned from my father, you know, how to take a stand, when to take a stand, when not to take a stand. So that was the formative experience of my life.
Now, when I used to tell people many years ago that I was a philosophy major, people said to me, what a brilliant vocational choice. That is, you know, you're really headed right for a career, aren't you? And I had no answer to that. Now, do you think that there was any part about your lifelong passion to think about, to write philosophy, to think about your mentor, Karl Popper, that actually served you particularly in being able to be as successful as you are on Wall Street?
Yes. I may not have been able to communicate my philosophy or explain it, but it has certainly guided me, and it has guided me both in making money and in spending it. So it has been the the sort of the connecting link between those two aspects of my existence.
Now, if this were a television program, I'd say, well, in 30 seconds, could you explain that life's philosophy and how it affected your business? So I won't ask you to do it in 30, but in what sense did it help? Did it?
Well, basically the problem that I was trying to resolve is the problem of a thinking participant. That is, when you are thinking, you try to understand, but when you are participating, you change the situation in which you participate. So how can you gain knowledge? See, the definition of truth, correspondence theory of truth, a statement is true if it corresponds to the facts. Now, in being a thinking participant, you're not dealing with facts because your actions change what you think about. And this is the conundrum that we all face. Now, we haven't really quite drawn the conclusions from this. Stating it like this, it's more, sort of more or less commonplace. But for instance, it means that there is a difference between the social sciences and the natural sciences. Because in natural sciences, you are actually dealing with facts. So, for instance, my theory of reflexivity is very similar to Heisenberg's theory of our principle of uncertainty. But the behavior of atoms or particles doesn't change when Heisenberg pronounces his theory of principle of uncertainty. Whereas our society or our life changes depending on what theories we hold. So there is an additional element of uncertainty in social affairs.
And in part, it seems to have been your gift to be able to have seen that at work in markets. I mean, you seemed at times to be able to say, all right, everybody thinks this is a rational process, these stocks are being valued in some perfect marketplace, but there's an uncertainty going on here, or irrationality, or something going on.
It's quite. It would be irrational to follow the principle of rational expectations because of this uncertainty. And certainly at the time when I started in business, you had a sort of prevailing dogma, which rational expectations. Markets tending towards equilibrium and so on. So at that time, I think I was a little bit ahead of the crowd by recognizing the uncertainty.
I want to just say one area on the world of finance, because back in the late 60s, when conglomerates were all the rage, you said early that you thought there was a kind of I don't know if you used the word bubble, but it was that idea that there was a kind of if I may use this term, irrational exuberance about the feeling that, well, if it's a conglomerate, it's going to be great.
Right.
And getting out early was a big help.
Right.
All right, now we fast forward 30-something years to the dot-com boom. Same thing?
It was the same thing. The important thing to understand about it is that it actually changes reality. In other words, it isn't just that there is irrational exuberance, but that exuberance actually changes, it can justify itself for an extended period of time. So you have an initially self-reinforcing, but eventually unsustainable and self-defeating process. And that is more characteristic of financial markets than equilibrium. So and not only of financial markets, but also of history in general.
So that just on the financial market thing for a while, if somebody calls himself jeffgreenfield.com and I have no profit plan and no business plan, I'm still going to get people to buy $2 billion worth of stock for a while until they see that I'm walking on air.
Right.
Yeah.
But it has actually, changed. For instance, it has led to the very rapid introduction of internet. It couldn't have grown as fast if it hadn't been for the hype. So now, for instance, you have the other side of it. and with, for instance, the Enron scandal, and a number of other things that are happening are the negative aspects of that boom-bust.
Let me now make a bridge between the first part of your career and where we are, where you've been for the last while. Because there was something interesting that you said, and I kind of alluded to it in introducing you. You said there is a tendency in our society to exaggerate the importance of money. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think your ideas about the international community, about reform, about all the things you're involved in, got a better hearing as you accumulated great sums of money. That people assumed, well, he's got to know what he's talking about here because look at all the money he's made.
Well, absolutely. I mean, since I haven't been terribly successful in, let's say, expounding my philosophy as such, the fact that I have a platform is entirely due to the fact that I've made a few $1 billion.
I get that, but I cannot forbear pointing out that if Donald Trump had tried to do what you did, I'm not sure all his money would have made much difference. But
well,
so there's a limit, isn't there?
Well, that's true. And also, I should point out that in a way, the financial markets served as a laboratory for testing my ideas. So I think the fact that I've been successful at least sets up some, let's say, justification for thinking that there is something in those ideas, that they are not all nonsense.
Now, one of the things, and I don't know if I'm reading your history right, and I have a feeling you'll tell me if I'm not, but it's interesting to me that many of the things you first got involved in seemed to be, you looked at a closed society and you saw signs that the ice was cracking, and that's when you moved. 1979, the first signs that maybe in South Africa something may be changing. They want to admit blacks to the University of Cape Town. Black students have no money. You say, okay, I'll pay their room and board. You see in Hungary that the authorities are kind of letting economists have a free flow of information. You say, all right, let's send them a lot of books. Let's send them a bunch of Xerox copiers to increase the flow of information. You see Gorbachev in the Soviet Union inviting Sakharov back to Moscow. You say, is it correct to say that is a key to what you're doing, that you needed to see some sign of an opening in a previously closed society to say, now I can move?
Yeah. Basically, I look at history the same way as I look at financial markets. And in fact, I think of financial markets as a historical process. In other words, that they're not really tending towards equilibrium. They never go back to where they came from. They always move forward in some way. And the same is true of history. So I think that, and there are certain signs that I look for in financial markets to indicate that there is what I call a reflexive process in the making. And the same applies to history. And certainly I could see an opening in the Soviet system. And in fact, I sort of interpreted it as a boom-bust a kind of sequence which was approaching the bust. When I started first, I set up my first foundation in Hungary in '84. That was during the communist regime, and my concept was that the communist dogma is false. And if you can show an alternative, if you expose it to any kind of alternative, its falsehood will become more apparent. Therefore, if you support anything that is not official state and party operation, but just empower people to do the things that they want to do, then the system will crumble. It was a very simple, very abstract idea, and it worked.
But it's interesting to me that when China seemed to be opening, and I think what you've described can be shown perfectly by the fact that among the things that your foundations or organizations sponsored were, for instance, an attempt to find folk art and music that had been suppressed during the Cultural Revolution. That would be an indication of an attempt to say, all right, anything that isn't this official dogma will help.
Yeah.
But ultimately in China, it didn't, at least not yet. It hasn't yet cracked because, at least as I read the history, the folks in charge, they may be letting go economically, but they're not letting go politically or culturally. Is that right?
Well, I set up, I took that idea to China. It's the same idea that I had in Hungary in '84, I took to China in '87. And I set up a foundation there. And while the foundation in Hungary succeeded, the foundation in China failed. Because the idea that I brought there was actually an alien idea for the Chinese. They have a certain mentality which I call the feudalism of the mind. And that is that they have a certain allegiance to a group. And they don't have the same tradition of freedom and independence that we have. So I took that alien idea there, and it failed. And I recognized that it was my fault in not understanding, how China is different from us.
This raises a question that I've been asking as many people as I can, and it seems like it's an interesting one to put on the table for you. Because it relates to where we're going next, which is this whole war on terrorism and what to do about it. If you'd looked at Nazi Germany and Tojo and Hirohito's Japan when we were fighting them, you would not have seen many signs of an open society. And yet, 5 years after the end of World War II, roughly 5 years, both of those societies were open, stable, democratic, and allied with the West. And what some people have raised about this is the idea that says, well, what does that teach us? That you can take alien, hostile ideologies that have no contact with freedom, and if you defeat them soundly enough and occupy them and are beneficent, you can turn them around very quickly. Is there anything to that?
Well, I think that well, certainly what you say is right, but I think that, for instance, Japan has many features, it still does, that don't make it entirely an open society. And in fact, Japan got into a lot of trouble when it opened up its financial system. It had a very good, well-functioning financial system as long as it was closed, as long as there were no alternatives. Then when it was opened up, it effectively collapsed. And China today faces the same problem. I went back to China after 12 years, just recently. And I had some meetings. I was sort of, how shall I say, we re-established good, cordial relations and this was the point that I was trying to bring home to the Chinese leadership, that joining the World Trade Organization, they are taking a tremendous risk. And to prepare for that risk, they have really got to move towards greater freedom of speech, freedom of information, even political freedom, because otherwise they will actually get into very serious difficulty.
Are they listening to you on this? Do they believe you?
Well, we had a good conversation, and they said, this is very interesting, but let's get back to the financial markets.
See, here's what I'm getting at. You, trying to calculate, about 10 or 12 days ago, let's say 2 weeks ago, gave us a speech. You called it a conversation, okay, in which you were very critical about the Bush administration and its post-September 11th line. And this is what I want to push you on. You said, how can we escape from the trap that terrorists have set us? Only by recognizing that the war on terrorism cannot be won by waging war. We must, of course, protect our security, but we must also correct the grievances on which terrorism feeds. Now, the counter-argument that some in the Bush administration and some thinkers would argue is, wait a second, if you look at what we did in Germany and Japan, first we beat the hell out of them, and then their societies will reform. So that this, they would argue, is typical woolly-headed international thinking. You know, we have got to use overwhelming force, change the regimes that are spreading this terrorism if necessary, and that's the way to long-term peace. To which you would say?
Well, to which I would say that you have got to defend yourself against terrorism. In other words, you can't ignore it or not react to it. But if you think that you can defeat terrorism by using overwhelming force, then I think you are actually doing what the terrorists want you to do. Because by applying overwhelming force, you then generate further resentment, and there is a sort of a pattern that would actually feed terrorism. So I think this war on terrorism actually reminds me of the war on drugs. It's the same sort of thing. There is a problem. Drug abuse, that's a problem. You have to deal with it, but you can't have a drug-free America, and you can't have a world without terrorists. But what the effect of the terrorists have, whether they have followers, you see, that depends on how people feel, whether they have grievances that the terrorists can play off, or whether they basically content and therefore they don't sympathize with the terrorists. I mean, we need, in order to let's say, discover terrorists and locate them, we need cooperation. We need people who will inform on them because they don't like what they're doing. So this idea of war on terrorism is a false metaphor. And a false metaphor can do tremendous damage.
Let's look at this, and let me offer you a different counter-argument. This notion that without dealing with the grievances, I know you're not saying a one-on-one, but if we don't deal with the grievances, that we'll never win. Now, let me make the argument that what you may be ignoring here is something very dark and deep in human nature. For instance, Yugoslavia, Serbia, was a first world country, certainly in relative terms quite prosperous, and yet Slobodan Milosevic in the late 1980s was able to rise to power by feeding grievances not about education, income, but a 500-year-old battle of Kosovo, that the Serbs had been humiliated by their enemies and it was time for vengeance. And he got the presidency of Serbia by that, wound up killing tens of thousands of people. Osama bin Laden has never talked about the grievances in terms of lack of education and poverty, most of which have been imposed by the Muslim rulers of this country. He's still angry that the Moors were driven out of Spain by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. And my point is, isn't this notion of going to the root causes and that's how we're going to fix it, ignoring this whole other dimension of human beings and our response to these kinds of...
Yeah, you're right in what you say about bin Laden and terrorists in general. Therefore, you can't cure terrorism by going to the root causes either. In other words, you can't, let's say, deal with Milosevic. Sometimes you actually have to go to war. I was very much in favor of intervening in Yugoslavia. So it's not an either-or situation. I think that there is a false metaphor involved about waging war on terrorists as opposed to waging war on Milosevic, because Milosevic represented a state, it was an army, you could deal with it in that way, whereas terrorism is something else. But the point I would make is that you have got to have a two-pronged approach. So the fact that I say that we ought to address the root causes doesn't mean that we should not stand up to terrorism.
In this, I promise, I have a feeling this audience is saying, when are you going to ask him? And I will. We're going to turn to the Middle East at some point here, I promise you, because it has such implications. But I want to stay for a bit about this pretty tough criticism you made about the Bush administration. I take it your fundamental argument really is that they just don't, they're just too indifferent to the rest of the world.
Look, I think that we have to recognize that we are the most powerful nation in the world today. We have our economic, financial power, our military power is unparalleled. Now, we are in fact the dominant power in the global capitalist system. We are in a position to address the shortcomings of the system, and only we are in a position to do so, because we have that leadership position. We can't, it's not that we can do anything we want, but basically nothing can happen without our cooperation in the way of anything to do with international arrangements, international laws, international institutions. We have a veto. In the case of the United Nations, of course, there are others who have a veto. In the monetary field, nobody else has the veto except us. And I think that we are misusing our power by trying to gather more power and projecting that power and wanting to dominate, because that causes resentment. I think we are successful enough that we ought to devote more of our resources and more of our attention to making the world a better place.
Now, that's where I want to now turn, but before I do, I just need to know what the implications of what you've been saying about terrorism and how you fight it, what implications you draw for the, if any, for the current Middle East. I don't even know the right word to use. Upheaval, crisis, it almost seems too easy, too mild. But so if, for instance, if the Israelis say, look, that's all well and good, the Palestinians need a state, they've got to have a sense of, but you know, as long as they and their leaders and half of the Arab states, as long as their real goal is the extermination of Israel, we got a problem here before we get to step B.
Yeah, well, there is a genuine, a legitimate grievance of the Palestinians that Israel has failed to address. I mean, these refugee settlements have been there for 50 years. So, and actually there was a very courageous attempt to bring about peace by Rabin. It came awfully close to success. So close.
You mean Rabin or Barak?
I'm talking about Rabin first,
okay.
Because that was really when there was really a kind of a sense of reconciliation as well as just a settlement. It was a kind of an emotional breakthrough at the time. And there were extremists on the Israeli side who did not want a settlement, and Rabin was killed by Israeli extremists. Similarly, I am very critical of the Sharon government's policies. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm condoning Arafat or think that he is right in what he's doing. But I think both sides are now dominated by extremists. And there is a certain sort of boom-bust kind of self-reinforcing process where there's a victim who becomes perpetrator, who then creates more of a sense of injustice, which then feeds on itself. And this is really a race to the bottom. And there is this element, in my view, in the Middle East today. And I think that is a terrifying example for us in the United States to contemplate, because I think we have got people similar to Arafat and Sharon in our government today. And you know, it's not polite to name names, but
well,
you know,
in fact, you did 10 days ago.
Yeah, you know, I think Cheney, Rumsfeld, Ashcroft have the same mindset.
Let me just revisit this, because again, this is not far from the hearts of many people there. Understanding what you have said, understanding that Ariel Sharon is not Rabin, is not Barak, if the other side's fundamental problem is that they want to see the state of Israel as a Jewish state eliminated. I don't necessarily mean the people. I mean, one of the Hamas said, oh no, you know, the Jews can stay here as long as they're willing to live in an Islamic state of Palestine. If that first hurdle isn't clearly cleared, as Sadat cleared it back in the 70s, as Jordan did in the, I guess, the early 90s, maybe earlier, if that isn't cleared, how does anything? I mean, I know what people out there, some people out there are going to say to you is that you're a moral equivalency guy. Mm-hmm. You can't see the difference between one state that's got flaws, it's democratic, but it's got flaws, it's got bad leaders, it isn't, and these other guys who simply want this other state to go away.
Yeah. Look, clearly you need an Israeli state that is secure. You also need a Palestinian state, so you need both, and I think that you need both sides to recognize that. Now, you know, let's say Saudi Arabia made a gesture about recognizing Israel as a state. Of course, it was a little bit of a, you know, there's a little twist to it because you still have the problem of the refugees returning, and you can't have it both ways. In other words, you can't, if you divide a country into two states, Israel and Palestine, then clearly the Arabs can only return to Palestine and not to Israel. So actually, the solution to the problem is obvious. You know, it's two states. Side by side. Right now, they have to be very kept apart because of the tremendous animosity and that has been built up. But they do have to live side by side. Now, there are elements on both sides that don't want to get there, and they are successful.
Okay, I want to move a little bit toward the broader issues of globalization and some of the things that you have said about this. It's interesting that, you know, at this point now, every time there is a conference of financial movers and shakers, I'm sure you're at all of these, you know, or invited at all of them.
Just a few of them.
Okay. It's the World Trade Organization, it's Seattle, it's Italy, it's the Waldorf, wherever. And there are great numbers of people who fundamentally have argued that globalization in and of itself is responsible for increasing inequality and decreasing opportunity for the poor of the world. So let's talk about a couple of these things. First, is globalization, as you see it, inevitable and well, let's start there. Is it something that's happened and that's it, and then that's irreversible?
No, I don't think it's irreversible. It has happened before, and it has been reversed before, because you had basically very similar conditions in the late 19th century. I mean, I define globalization in a very narrow sense. To me, globalization is the globalization of financial markets. The fact that capital can move wherever it wants to freely. And that is a relatively new development in the current stage. I mean, we've been, moving towards globalization since the Second World War, but I would say that it's really only since 1980, when you had Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in England, that financial markets became truly global. Now, that has some very positive effects and some negative ones. Because capital can move around freely, it means that it can't be regulated or taxed as easily as it could before. Now, capital and private enterprise is very good at creating wealth. So liberating capital in this way has, I think, accelerated wealth creation of private wealth. But markets are not designed to provide public goods. That is the task of the state, or in this globalized world, you actually need some international arrangements. And that is what is missing from globalization. It's a lopsided development.
Let me see if I can get very specific about what you want to see happen. I mean, classic example. A country like the United States has labor laws, health and safety laws, minimum wage laws. Capital now can flee. You don't have to make the sneakers in the United States. You make them in Bangladesh, and with virtually, let's say, no regulation at all about wages, safety, anything, right?
Yeah, yes.
What's to be done about that?
Well, that is a very difficult problem.
You only want you don't want easy questions.
Yeah, no, and I don't have sort of a 30-second answer to it either. I've sort of examined the various institutions we have. We don't have similarly effective organizations for protecting labor, for instance. So today, China is a inexhaustible source of cheap labor, whose efficiency is improving by leaps and bounds, but there is no freedom of association. So the Chinese workers can't get their share of the increased efficiency, and that needs a strengthening of the International Labor Organization, ILO. Now, interestingly, the ILO has a very similar structure to the WTO. It has the ability to impose sanctions similar to the WTO. The only problem is that the countries haven't actually subscribed to the covenants of the ILO. There are 67 covenants, let's say, and the United States has registered 2 of them. And of course, China has registered none. So I think you need to strengthen the International Labor Organization.
Okay, now, I'm sure this sounds, protectionist or retro, but what would be, from your point of view, what would be the problem with the United States, by legislation, saying to these companies, almost all of them want a deal in the American market, if your goods are made under those circumstances, under those conditions, you can't bring them into the United States and sell them? Clearly an interference with movement of capital, but on the other hand, What's wrong with that as a reform?
The only
mechanism?
thing wrong with it is that it would destroy the WTO regime. In other words, it would destroy free trade because, according to the rules of the WTO, that doesn't come into account. You're not allowed to use slave labor. That there's a rule against that, but there is no rule against cheap labor. And in effect, if you can produce cheaper in other countries, both sides benefit. I mean, international trade does benefit both sides. Where the deficiency is on the political side, that in China, if anybody tries to organize the workers, he ends up in prison. And that's where the deficiency is.
Do you believe, as some people do, that if a regime opens itself up economically, it is in effect going to have to open up politically? That is, I mean, people think that to some extent that happened in Hungary. They tried to open up economically. The economists and business people said, you got to let us have more information, and it was inevitable. Do you think it's inevitable that a country that liberalizes economically, even one like China, will sooner or later find itself, whatever it wanted to do, becoming free politically?
Not at all, not at all, because people who, the rulers don't actually like to abdicate their rules, so they do need to be pushed before they change. And of course they have to be pushed internally, but they also have to be pushed externally. And in fact, most of my efforts have been devoted to strengthening the demands internally for freedom, open society.
You were very successful. I think some people would say surprisingly so, back in the late 70s and in the 80s particularly, in going to societies that weren't free and saying, well, open up a little bit, we'll work with you. It happened in Hungary, it happened in the old Soviet Union to some extent. Do you think that kind of approach could work in, let's say, the Muslim world, which has never been through any kind of modernity? There's no real even economic development going. In other words, is what worked for you in Hungary, what you tried in China, what worked in the Soviet Union, what worked in...
It didn't work in Chine, of course.
It didn't work. I say it didn't work.
Yeah.
What you tried.
And of course, it probably wouldn't work in Islamic countries. But it's very interesting. I've met with some human rights activists actually in Lebanon, and this man said, we really have no space for civil society. The Western powers deal with the government. They want, because they are interested in resources or in some geopolitical considerations, they have not been at all supportive of civil society. The only place where you can express your disagreement with a regime which we consider an imposition, an oppressive regime, is in the mosque. There you can speak under the umbrella of religious expression. So opposition has gathered in the mosque the same way as in Poland. The opposition found an umbrella under the Catholic Church. I mean, it's not that it would really change things dramatically, or that you could sort of suddenly move over to. But we have been very neglectful of the internal conditions that prevail in these countries, because we have been interested in the natural resources, and it's the rulers who have the title. And so we've been dealing with them, and we have ignored what they do internally.
But if the kind of messages that are being delivered in the mosques in some of these countries are not exactly the same messages that were being delivered in the churches of Poland.
Right.
I mean, quite the contrary. What part of their argument is that their rulers aren't bombing Tel Aviv right now.
Right.
So I guess my question is, if there were 30 younger, they don't have to be younger, 30, 20, 15 George Soroses out there with a great deal of capital and a willingness to spend it in creative ways as you did, and they said, we really want to see if we can begin to help change or create open societies in the Muslim world, is there anything concrete you could tell them to do now?
Well, I think that particularly the role of women in Muslim societies is a sort of that is an area where there is room for opening, because it is sort of penetrating into these societies that there's an inequality between in the position of women. So I think there's room for a women's movement in these countries, which could move the countries in the direction of open society. But I mean, if you take a country like Egypt, there are a lot of people who are not happy with the regime, who are not Muslim fundamentalists, and they also have no room to express themselves. Now, of course, the problem is that most of the people in those countries, if they were free to express themselves, would turn towards Islamic fundamentalism. In Algeria, for instance, they were about to win the elections when the military intervened. Right. Now, in my opinion, if they had been allowed to win, today Algeria would be ripe for democracy, in the same way as Iran, where the religious extremism took power. There is a very strong movement for open society.
Are you involved at all in Iran?
No, I'm not involved in I think it would be very dangerous. But I'm aware of what's going on, and I read there are Muslim clerics that are quoting Karl Popper and go to jail.
I'm going to turn to the audience questions, which look pretty interesting. But I do, before we do, I don't mean fundamentally in the Islamic sense, but at root, let's say, the work you've done, very creative, far more flexible than government foreign aid as we think about it. You've got people like Bill Gates come in with the Gates Foundation. I think it's a $17 billion endowment. Do you believe that individuals with that kind of with those kinds of resources and the willingness to be creative can change the world more than governments and international institutions, or is it too big a job to just be left to individuals no matter how much money they have?
I think that we can make a contribution and we can show the way, but I think you need governmental resources to back it up. I mean, you know, I'm spending $500 million a year. What you need for the Millennium targets is $50 billion. So, but I think where we can be helpful is in, let's say, making the aid more effective. Because the trouble is, a lot of it has been actually counterproductive, because the aid is designed to serve the interests of the donors first, and the recipients second. I think why I have been, to the extent that I've been successful, is because I actually have no axe to grind. I let the people in the country decide their priorities. And I think if we did the same with our official development assistance, it would actually be much more effective.
Footnote to this: do you like the notion of the very small scale efforts like the micro banks, where they lend, say, $25 to an Indian woman to buy a sewing machine, and then she becomes self-sufficient, and then they pay the loans back? Is this something you think
it's something that I think works. It has been shown to work. I think it needs to be scaled up. And for that, you see, you need something more than what is happening today. And that would be one of the things that I would do, is to create the infrastructure that would make it on a much larger scale.
Okay, your questions. These are a wide range, which we always get. This is a nice, easy one. Who was the greatest world leader of the past 30 years?
Well, whom do I admire most?
I
I would say Sakharov was the man whom I really admired.
Andrei Sakharov.
Andrei Sakharov, because of his moral stance. Not that he was not successful, but you know, in order to, when you stand for something, you have to fight losing battles, and he was one of those.
As you recall, and I know I'm going to mispronounce this name. This is a question about the head of Malaysia. Is it Dr. Mahathir?
Mahathir.
Yeah. Left out a vowel, but all right. As you recall, Dr. Mahathir, I'm sure you recall this, blamed you for the economic problems of Malaysia when they collapsed. He made some pretty sharp anti-Semitic remarks. So first, what are you doing to reduce the anti-Semitic plague in the world, and what are you doing for Israel? Do you feel any responsibility to act in these areas?
Well, I've always regarded anti-Semitism as a kind of a meta problem. In other words, it's something that you can't really deal with directly, but indirectly. In other words, in a way, I feel that I'm fighting anti-Semitism by promoting an open society. That's, you know, indirectly related to it.
And as for the second part of the question about Israel, do you have any involvement in Israel? Foundation work there?
Very little. I have actually supported a media center in Palestine, which was critical of Arafat. Now, unfortunately, that media center has now been destroyed. But I thought that was an important thing, to help the Palestinian state to develop into an open society and not dominated by people who want to destroy Israel.
What do you think of the anti-globalization demonstrations? Do they help the poor or hurt the poor?
I think that they were actually helpful in drawing the attention of the authorities and the elites that there is something wrong. I think that their thrust was misdirected, because it was directed at the international institutions that we have, whereas really most of the misery and poverty in the world today is due to bad government in less developed countries. That's why one of the reasons why they are less developed.
Do you agree with the man whose name, of course, at this age I have forgotten? He's a Nobel laureate, an Indian, who argues that
Amartya Sen.
Yeah, that democracy is a great antidote to poverty.
Yes, he says development is freedom, and I subscribe to that.
I only interviewed him a couple of years ago, so we better finish this interview fast before I decide that I'm interviewing the manager of the New York Yankees. There are a couple of these questions are unavoidable, but they're not. They're friendly. What's your favorite thing to spend money on? Or, and it is a different question, what do you do for fun?
Well, first of all, I like to do some sports. I play tennis, ski, and so on. And I like to read, and I like to have a good discussion.
You don't need billions of dollars, do you? And this is not the same question, but it's the question here. I love this. This is why I like this. Do you do well at the racetrack too? And the point about that question is, does it all boil down to being a superb gambler, and isn't that a gift? Now, before you shake your head, in this biography of yours that I read, both your son and a long-term acquaintance have said this about you. They said he thinks it's a science, but it's not. It's this intuitive art. His body, you get back spasms when you feel something coming. Is that true?
Well, that is true, but that wouldn't help me at the racetrack.
Okay. But I guess the question is, at some point, doesn't it come down whether it's that good-looking 3-year-old Belmont or that questionable new monetary instrument that you get some point you just have to say, I'm going.
Well, I think that it's preferable to bet when you have an edge. When you think you know something that the others don't. Now, you may have that knowledge in the racetrack, and some people do, but I don't.
Okay. Why shouldn't the heads of Enron and Arthur Andersen be jailed for 20 years?
Why shouldn't
they? Question is,
yeah, no, look, I think that there's been a definite excess. They've misused the rules that prevail, and they are responsible. I'm particularly critical of the auditing profession. I was just reading an article in the New Yorker describing the fact that they were lobbying, they were fighting with the SEC.
When Arthur Levitt tried to separate the consulting
and that is, you see, I think that as long as you play by the rules, that's fine. But when you bend the rules, and particularly when you fix the rules, and use your clout, your financial clout, to introduce or abolish regulations and so on, that's where we are going wrong.
The second part of this question, I didn't mean to leave it out. China leads the way in punishing white-collar crime. What is your opinion?
Well, I'm somewhat critical of the Chinese judiciary system. In other words, they execute people a little bit too freely, and it's very interesting. I had very good discussion about this in China. They are now moving to establish a genuine legal system for commercial law. But they are very far from using those principles in criminal law.
I think that's the heart of this question, is that apparently what you're saying is that, at least in China, they really think they can just split this difference, that they can be an open economic society or more open and a closed political society.
Yes.
Now, this is a nice, easy one, okay? What is your outlook for the global geopolitical economic trends in the next 5 to 100 years? I would say mixed, but you may have
a good answer.
You may have a more subtle answer than that.
No, I think it's a good answer. I actually think that we have a choice. And we can make this global system work by addressing the shortcomings, or it's going to collapse, as it collapsed before. And it will collapse politically, in other words, for political development. And since the United States is the linchpin, we are the imperial power in the world today, it's up to us which way we go. And the trouble is that we don't have the vision or the sense of responsibility that goes with our position. And we don't have the leadership. I'm very critical of the Bush administration, but I'm also very critical of the Democrats because they don't offer an alternative vision. So the way we are going, I don't think the system will last, because if the participants don't benefit from it, it's basically an unstable system.
But you know, maybe it's because I'm in the middle of this, of two different books. One is this Robert Caro biography of Lyndon Johnson, where now roughly about 50 years ago, and sometime in the next 200 years he's going to get to the presidency. And another book is about Cicero, that's about 2,000 years ago. And I come away with these books very depressed because, and maybe I shouldn't be, because it's the same damn thing over and over. It's greed and it's short-sightedness and it's appealing for it's pandering for political gain, for the shortest term goal. And as far as I can tell, and you may have a different example, except for the years after World War II, this country has never been really, the United States, forget Rome for a minute. This country's never been very big about taking on an international responsibility with vision. So
yeah, but you know, it's a relatively new position for us to be in. We've had very strong principles of freedom internally with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and so on. But it's only in the last 50 years that we have become the leading power in the world. Now, in that respect, we are now occupying a position similar to Britain in the 19th century. And we have to somehow live up to that responsibility. So I think we have reason to worry with the way we are going about it, but I don't think it's a reason to give up hope, because I think it's possible that we actually, change our attitude. And I think we really need to work on a change of heart in the United States.
this is an interesting one. How do you measure the success of your foundations and your efforts? I mean, you're in, I guess, now 50 countries now. There have been times when you've looked at something and said, rolled it up, right?
Yeah.
Didn't work.
Yeah. There is actually no reliable, objective criterion by which to judge it. It's different from making money. Because making money, you've got the bottom line. And here you've got a great number of lines, how you affect different people in a society. And you can't add it up, because they are different people and different interests. So in the end, it's really a hunch. And one has to be very much aware of the unintended consequences of what you do. And the first rule is try to do no harm.
There are a few more I'm going to get to before, but I need to interject one question here that I just wonder about. It would seem to me that one of the permanent conditions of your efforts is that every so often, and maybe it's more than every so often, somebody's going to come into your orbit who's interested not in making the world better, but saying, this is a man with a great deal of money, and I want to get my hands on some of it. So I guess part of the question is, how does someone like yourself learn to develop that mix between too much trust and not enough trust? I mean, you know, how do you split the difference between being credulous and paranoid?
Well, I think you have to start with the assumption that foundations are there to be taken advantage of. In other words, people will come and apply, and they'll tell you what you want to hear, and then they'll do what they want to do. So that is, and I don't think one should be angry with them for taking that. So you have to have certain processes like competitions. Mm-hmm. So that you ask people to say, this is the area where we are willing to support, please submit your proposals, and then we choose. And of course, sometimes we choose badly, but the fact that you've got competition is a help.
So my proposal for a study of the impact of sudden unearned wealth on a late middle-aged man probably doesn't have much of a chance, I guess. Okay.
Well, submit it by all means.
Couple of specific questions. Where will the euro take the world economy? The euro.
Well, look, the euro is a political creation, and I think you can't have a common market without a common currency. So it creates greater unity in Europe. You then have a problem of the relation between the two major currencies, and there are possible problems there.
But if you're looking at the grave or the gravest situations facing either the Anglo-American or the European-American economy or the world economy, do you rank the euro problem fairly high, or is it?
No. I think the euro actually is, it's in existence. It has its problems. Altogether, Europe now is in a really interesting phase of its development. In the next couple of years, some really major decisions have to be made about the future of Europe.
What about Argentina? Is it going to survive the present financial chaos?
I would say it's the worst of all possible worlds. It's a disorderly breakdown, and it's sort of it's a worst financial disaster, I would say, since the 30s.
Really?
It's of course
worse than
confined
the
to
South Asian collapse of a few years ago? Worse,
oh, yes.
Much worse?
Yes.
And for somebody who never took economics 1, I'm quite serious about this. Why should we worry about that? In other words, for a lot of us, we see that in the paper, page 1, Argentine financial crisis, we go, oh, and we turn the page. Because I'll speak for myself, I still don't fully grasp what it could mean for us. What could it mean for us?
No, it doesn't mean much for us. It means a lot for them.
Yeah, okay, well, my heart goes out to them, but it's not like that's the starting point of international.
And actually we can't solve their problem, but we are a little bit pregnant. Because we are involved through the IMF and so it isn't that we can just sort of ignore it.
What about Cuba? This is a world tour. What's your prognosis for a post-Castro era, and what should we be doing to breathe life into this communist regime? Let's amend that. What should we be doing to breathe life into, or should we be doing anything? Are you involved at all in Cuba?
No, actually, I'm not. I'm already suffering from imperial overstretch, so I don't think I can be involved in everything. But, our position towards Cuba is actually, we treat it as an internal political problem. That is to say, how does it affect the elections? And there are basically two types of Cubans in America. There are people who had property and have no family, and people who had no property and have family in Cuba. And the first group dominates our policy. And I think it's wrong. I think we should have lifted the sanctions long ago.
Will the U.S. effort to cut off the sources of money for terrorism succeed or fail? What's the best way to succeed in this effort? We heard an awful lot about the effort to dry up the terrorist source of funds, and that we try to engage other countries in it. Can it work?
Well, I think it can make an impact, and there's a really major effort going on. And it's the sort of thing that needs to be done to protect against terrorism. Now, it's interesting that we were opposed to the OECD standards for international cooperation on disclosing information prior to September 11. The Bush administration refused to cooperate. Now they are leading the charge. And there are many other things that could be done by greater cooperation in this field, not only about terrorism. Actually, my current sort of top favorite is a cooperation to force or oblige the oil companies and natural resource companies to disclose how much money they pay to individual countries. So, for instance, Angola or Nigeria, how much money they actually pay for those resources. And you could then add it up, and you could then look at the budget and see how much it goes into the budget. And you would find that there are several $billion missing. So this is, for instance, one area of international cooperation which could make a major difference to the prosperity of those countries. Nothing to do with terrorism.
That's okay. It's missing not because they're funneling it to terrorism; they're just stealing it. You mean?
Pardon?
Where is that money going? That's missing. It's being stolen.
It's going into the bank accounts of the presidents.
Right.
And this is something that we could actually stop. I think the oil companies would favor it. They'd be quite happy with it, as long as the other oil companies are obliged to do it, you see. So this is now, I'm saying this is my top priority now, is because Africa is on the agenda of the G8 in June. Then there is a new economic program for Africa, and this is missing. I think adding this into it would make the whole thing much more effective.
Just wrap this up by coming home, literally. If you feel as strongly as you do that this is the one country that has the power financially to reshape these international arrangements and therefore to change the world for the better, and you don't like the direction that things are going in now, to what extent have you used your resources, which is a polite word for money, to influence domestic politics? Do you contribute a lot of money to candidates?
As little as possible, but I do give whatever is $1,000 or $2,000 to certain.
Well, that's the hard money limits.
That's the hard money.
There are soft monies which you still have until November 6th, which are unlimited, I believe. Yeah. But my question's serious. I mean, you're involved all over the world trying to make life better for people. And somebody could say to you, well, wait a second, if this is the country that's going to make all the difference and only the governments can do it, why aren't you your version of, say, a Rupert Murdoch? Why aren't you starting magazines, newspapers, changing the intellectual political debate here at home and pouring money into candidates and groups that favor this view, so that if you change the United States view, you change the world?
Yes. Well, actually, I am devoting more attention to that because I believe that the role of the United States is so important in the world that I think one needs to push this point. I have been a supporter of clean money in elections. For instance, I've supported the Maine initiative and the Arizona initiative.
These are basically forms of public financing, sort of.
For elections. And I think they're working rather well in those. And I would say that if I saw a leader who articulated my vision of United States being a leader of a global open society, I would really stand behind him, because I think it's really very important. The problem is, I don't see such a leader. I have in the past been more of a Democrat than a Republican, so I'm not particularly sort of involved in politics, but I have been inclined. Frankly, I'm inclined to become a moderate Republican, because I think the moderate Republicans have done more to rein in the excesses of the Bush administration than the Democrats.
Interesting. Well, if you guys out there have been half as engrossed as I have, this has been worth your while. This has been an absolutely fascinating evening. George, Soros, thank you.